Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Neal Howard. Thank you for joining us here on Health Professional Radio with Dr. Kelly Ryan. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Dr. Ryan. Glad to have you here with us today. And you're here with us to talk about a different aspect of sports medicine as it relates to horse racing and the racing world and the employees that work therein. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Kelly.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today.
Give us a little background about yourself. You got into sports medicine. How did you get into sports medicine as it relates to thoroughbreds?
So that's actually, and this whole scenario is very interesting. I was interested in sports medicine from just doing a lot of sports when I was younger, and I was thinking, well, if I have to grow up and have a job, how cool would it be to be a sports doctor? Mm-hmm. And to take care of athletes. And so I did my residency training at MedStar in Baltimore, and then I went and did a fellowship with the University of Maryland and MedStar, and that was also, again, in Baltimore, where I actually had the opportunity to work with the Baltimore Ravens, some of the local colleges and some of the local high schools, taking care of all different kind of athletes, including football players, a lot of lacrosse players, of course, being in Maryland, soccer players, track players, swimmers, every different kind of athlete that you could think of until I finished my fellowship and I was looking for a job. And MedStar was coming up with this contract. They had just started with the Maryland Jockey Club and with the Maryland Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association. They were actually looking for medical providers for the racetrack. Mm-hmm. And at the time, when I first heard about it, I was like, well, what kind of athletes or sports medicine will I be doing at the racetrack? I was thinking, the only thing that I really knew about riders at that time was that they have pretty terrible falls, and I was thinking, well, you don't necessarily need a sports medicine doctor. You need more something like a trauma surgeon. Mm-hmm. But once I got there, we actually found out that the sports medicine model works really well at the racetrack. So when we first got there, it was kind of, working on all the kinks and things like that. And we've just kind of been going slowly and steady. And I think that we've, made a lot of really fantastic changes at the racetrack and really kind of bringing some attention to these jockeys who are probably some of the most toughest athletes I've ever worked with yet.
You're riding on this horse at 40, 50 miles an hour, and you're doing this as a living, not just for the fun of it. When some of these jockeys fall and suffer a head injury, say a concussion, we're talking about concussions just like in any other contact sport, say football, rugby, soccer. Do these head injuries differ in scope and severity from the ones that you've seen in other contact sports?
So it definitely has been a little bit of a learning process, from our standpoint. I've never taken care of a jockey prior to 2 years ago, with a concussion, let alone any other injury. But what I found is that while you would think that some of these concussions will be the worst concussions that you've ever seen, some of them will get up after having a major fall and be perfectly fine and not even have a concussion. Whereas I've seen a couple other athletes who had, maybe a mild head tap while playing football, on the line or even getting, even being hit in the head by a soccer ball and have really severe concussions. So it absolutely varies from each athlete to each athlete. Overall, I can't necessarily say that I've seen worse concussions specifically in jockeys, although that is something that you might expect. Now, there are a lot of differences between our jockeys that we take care of and our other athletes. So again, you're talking about a high-speed trauma here. Mm-hmm. So these jockeys, like you were saying before, they're actually riding about 40 miles an hour on a horse, and when they fall, there's also the risk of being run over by other horses, the horses behind you, which is a risk. The other thing is that their helmets are actually a little bit different than some of the other athletes. So those are all things that you have to take into consideration. The other thing is a lot of times when we have our field athletes, we don't necessarily always go send them to the emergency department and have them evaluated by something such as a CT scan, because we know that that doesn't really show a concussion. It would only show us, a brain bleed if that were happening. Imaging does not really, even an MRI won't show you a concussion. Mm-hmm. However, when you're evaluating these athletes that are having these high-speed falls, you have to be a little bit more cautious, not to just call it a concussion and make sure that there's not any other brain injury that may have occurred, or any kind of head injury that may have occurred, including fractures.
Is any impact injury to the head considered a concussion, whether severe or not? Or can you have an impact injury, say fall off a horse and seem to be totally fine? You've got a little bit of a bruise there, but it's not a concussion. Is that how it works? Or explain exactly what designates an injury as a concussion.
Yes. So the answer to your question is yes. You can actually have an impact without actually having a concussion. And you can have a concussion without actually having an impact.
Okay.
So these are kind of some of the gray zones that make someone who is proficient in evaluating concussions really important to have. And that's why I think that primary care sports medicine is such a growing field, and it's so necessary to have someone who has expertise in this area, not just your general practitioner, to evaluate athletes like this. So for your first question, yes, some of these jockeys that fall from high speeds, well, they may have a little bit of a headache that day, and the next day they may be perfectly fine, and they might not have any symptoms of a concussion. So then that makes our job really difficult, because we want to err on the side of caution because of something called second impact syndrome, mm-hmm. or if their brain is not recovered completely and they were to get a second impact, that could be really dangerous, and that could really lead to long-term side effects and chronic headaches and dizziness and things like that. So we want to make sure that we don't subject them to possibly having a second trauma if their brain is not truly recovered. However, sometimes you just bump your head and you have a headache. And sometimes you don't have a concussion. And so it can be difficult to really determine whether this is a traumatic headache or whether this is actually a concussion. So what we do is a whole bunch of sports medicine providers continue to do research in the field, and we have lots of conferences where we sit around and talk about these types of things. We have different physical exam findings. There's specific testing that we do on physical exams that can actually help us to determine whether we truly believe that an athlete has a concussion or whether they might just be suffering from from a headache. And the same thing as with other sports, sometimes I might truly really think that they might just have a headache, but I will still walk them through the steps of what we call a return to play or return to ride protocol to make sure that during those other steps, when I increase their heart rate and we increase the pressure in their brain, or when we start adding other types of movements, that they don't have symptoms of a concussion. So there's other ways to kind of test them and take them through the motions, but we might let them return maybe just a little bit faster if we really don't think that they have a concussion.
Now, in your experience, have you noticed that there are different signs and symptoms to look for in these jockeys as opposed to some of the other impact sports that you've had experience with? And once you answer that question, you said that there was specific testing that you did. Is that for head injuries specifically, or for specifically these types of athletes? So
for your first question, some of the things that we look for specifically are different changes in maybe balance, whether they're having fatigue. Fatigue is another sign of a concussion. Sometimes you can have some difficulty with concentration, with memory, those types of things. And so those are things that we look for specifically on physical exam. And then there's also other testing that they have. There's a couple different tools that we use. One of them is called the SCAT-3. And we've actually started doing baseline SCAT-3s. And we can certainly talk about that more. But so we have the SCAT-3, which is a sideline assessment tool that we use with any of our athletes. And so after an athlete has an injury, it's a battery of tests. What kind of symptoms are you having? What day is it? Do you know what year it is? Do you know where you are? Repeat these words back to me. Repeat these numbers backwards in the opposite order than I say them to you. So that kind of checks for concentration. Then you also have a coordination test that we do, and there's a balance test that we do. And so these are different tools that we can use to assess whether or not we believe that a patient has a concussion. Now, in terms of jockeys specifically, they still get all of the symptoms that any of my other field athletes get, and it varies with every single athlete. It's not necessarily that jockeys tend to have more of these symptoms than these symptoms, and it's the same with any other sport. The only difference that we really find that I've been finding in our athletes and our jockeys from falls is a lot of them actually almost act like car accidents. So that's another thing. You might not actually hit your head, but if you have a whiplash type of motion, then you still also could get a concussion because the brain is actually moving in the skull and can actually move forward and hit the front of your skull and go backwards and hit the back of your skull. And so that also can cause a concussion without you actually hitting your head. But a lot of these athletes, not necessarily in concussions, but they actually will act almost as a car accident where they have a lot of bad muscle spasm.
Now, where can our listeners go and get more information about concussions as they relate to the horse racing industry and MedStar itself?
So we're working on getting more information out on our website specifically, and we do have a Facebook page. And now in terms of MedStar Sports Medicine, we also have some physical therapy videos that are on there, and we have just some different links that you can find from our Facebook page. But the CDC actually has done a pretty good job on equestrian medicine, and concussions specifically to equestrian riders, not necessarily jockeys, but, other type of riders. There's also steeplechase riders. There's just regular equestrian for recreation. And so they actually have some good information on the CDC's Heads Up website.
Great. Well, thank you for talking with us today.
Oh, of course.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neal Howard, in studio with Dr. Kelly Ryan, and she's been with us talking about concussions as they relate to the horse racing industry. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at healthprofessionalradio.com.au and also at hpr.fm. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, listen in, and download at SoundCloud.